Thank you. Thank you very much, Andrew, for that awesome introduction. And thank you all for coming out here to this place that every time I'm here, I just have to look around and say, wow, what a cool place this is. So, you don't have to do it during the talk, but maybe afterwards, if you haven't, just take some time to drink in this setting and take time to explore the museum here and the library here. It's a pretty amazing place. I'm excited to be here. And I'm excited to be here talking about one of my very favorite topics. Now, the program intro that Andrew wrote up for this said that I'm going to look at the British Army in Boston in 1775 and talk about the strategic and the tactical and the logistical challenges and all the things this army faced and the way the commanders met those challenges. And I spec'd this out and said, all right, we can do this in about 45 hours. So to do it more effectively in 2 orders of magnitude less time than that, I am going to take a few shortcuts. When I think about the British Army in Boston, we can think about big numbers of homogeneous soldiers who are all kind of the same. There were this many. But when I think about an army, and because it's my area of study, the British Army, I look at a picture like this one and I say, well, I just don't want to think of that as a company of soldiers. I want to know who that guy is who's closest to the front. And I want to know who that guy is that's 4 men down from him. And I want to know who is on the other. I want to know these people as individuals. So besides talking about some of these generalized things about the Army, I'm also going to try to introduce you to a few individuals tonight. There's too many to introduce you to all of them, but we'll look at a few. The first man I want to mention by name is a soldier named John Young. He was a soldier in the 5th Regiment of Foot, which arrived in Boston in the early summer of 1774 and stayed in Boston until it was evacuated in 1776. He went on to fight at battles like Long Island and Brandywine. But while he was in Boston, take a look at the map that's on the screen. If you're not familiar with 18th century Boston, it doesn't look much like Boston looks today. Boston was on a peninsula, and it was connected to the mainland by a very narrow stretch of land. So the British Army was almost on an island. They were somewhat isolated there. And for obvious reasons, they really had to protect that little neck of land. So they had a couple of sets of lines and fortifications with gates and sentry boxes and redoubts and walls and all sorts of things across that neck of land, one on the mainland side and one back on the peninsular side of it. And John Young was standing sentry there one night. He was a private soldier. He was, I don't know which of these lines he was a sentry on, but it was early evening. The sun was setting, skies were starting to darken. It wasn't a dark and stormy night, but even though it wasn't, suddenly a shot rang out. It really did. And the soldiers around him and John Young could hear a musket ball whistle by. And John Young looked down from where he was standing and saw that ball splash in the water right near some soldiers who were standing by the shore. And they looked out and they saw a boat rowing off into the darkness. It headed back toward the city, but they couldn't track it in the fading light. And all of this happened on July 18th, 1774. Now, when did fighting break out in Boston that initiated the war that we call the American Revolution? When? Yeah, April of 1775. This happened 9 months before the war broke out. Americans in a boat took a shot at British soldiers. And this kind of thing happened a lot to the British soldiers in Boston before any war started. And it's important to recognize this when we think about how the British Army operated after the war started. These British troops had been sent to Boston in 1774 to try to prevent a war from beginning. Well, obviously it didn't go very well, right? But they weren't sent over here to make war. They were sent over here to keep the peace. And yet, once they arrived in Boston in the early summer of 1774, they were insulted by the populace on a regular basis. They were inveigled to desert. plied with bad liquor that would sometimes actually poisonous and killed soldiers. People in the local population in Boston would get these men drunk and then try to convince them to desert. Soldiers were assaulted in the streets by mobs. Sometimes soldiers were even kidnapped and carried out of Boston. This is the environment these soldiers were in a place where they were sent to keep the peace. Why so much hostility? It was terrible to be a British soldier in Boston, just in what's supposed to be a peacetime garrison. Why would that be? And to really understand that, we have to go all the way back to 1763. We have to go back 12 years. And when we study history, it's easy to just compress this. But think for a minute, as we think about 12 years, just think about your own life and all the things that happen in 12 years. All of the news headlines you see in 12 years. This is what's going on in America over a 12-year period. So even though we're going to crush this stuff up into a 2-minute slide, you have to think about it as being a long chunk of time of evolution of things going on. When the French and Indian War ended, the British Army, they won the war. Hey, we're the winners. And guess what we have to do now? We have this great big continent and we control a whole big chunk of it. And it has 3 big populations of people that don't like each other. What are we going to do about that? Well, that's all right. We can come up with a nice, harmonious plan that everyone will love. We have all the land from the East Coast to the Mississippi River. So we will simply say, all of the people of French heritage who are mostly Catholics in this region that we call Quebec, that I might actually sometimes just call Canada for convenience, will let them have that whole big area. And for all of the Native Americans who have been living on this land for time immemorial, we'll give them all of the land west of the Appalachian Mountains. That will be Indian Territory, the name actually used on British maps for this. And all of the European settlers, largely white settlers from England and Germany and other parts of Europe, they can settle on all the land east of the Appalachian Mountains. That will make everybody happy, won't it? Well, didn't work out so well. From the British perspective, said, well, we know that these settlers are going to keep trying to cross the mountains and settle on lands that they shouldn't, and the Indians are going to fight back against them and try to push them out of land they've already settled on, even if it's east of the Appalachians, and the Indians up in the north, in the area we now call Maine, that was part of the Massachusetts colony, they're going to come down and try to push settlers out, and the New England Protestants don't like the Canadian Catholics. So we're going to need to have troops over there to enforce these boundary lines. That only makes sense. We want to keep the peace. We have to have some people there keeping law and order. And that's going to be expensive. How are we going to pay for that when we've got this big old war debt from the French and Indian War? Well, we need some new revenue policies, some new tax policies. And we need to enforce some old tax policies that we haven't been enforcing for a long, long time. This all makes perfectly good sense so far. And if we want these troops stationed in North America, they got to live somewhere. So we'll put in place this thing called the Quartering Act. Now, a huge misunderstanding about the Quartering Act is that the Quartering Act allowed British troops to be quartered in private homes. And if all you have to do is read the text of the Quartering Act, which you can easily find online by searching for Quartering Act, it says right in it, you cannot quarter troops in private homes. It was not legal to do that. You could quarter them in public buildings, in inns, in taverns, in barns and outbuildings if necessary, but not in private homes. But the important thing about the Quartering Act is it said that the colonial governments must pay for the quartering and the provisioning of the troops. Where do colonial governments get money? They charge taxes to their citizens. They're allowed to do that. American citizens are paying lots of taxes in the colonies to their own local governments before any of this started. But there's got to be a new tax to pay for the quartering. Some colonies can build barracks, some can house in pub, but whatever, they have to pay for this somehow. Well, from a British perspective, this is all a very sensible approach. But from the American perspective, they said, well, all of these colonies were established by charters or other kinds of documents that, for the most part, said each colony is allowed to charge its own taxes and provide for its own defense. Now, some of these charters were created when the colonies were nothing more than a couple hundred people settling on a little patch of land on the coast. So these charters that were in many cases over 100 years old could arguably be called obsolete, but that was still the law. So there it was. You can levy your own taxes and provide for your own defense. So from the American perspective, these revenue policies, the taxation without representation, and the Quartering Act, and this land partitioning going on were violating their existing laws. Also a very logical perspective, right? And by the way, all those European settlers on the East Coast that were told, you can't cross those mountains anymore and settle over there, they really, really, really wanted that land. I mean, they really wanted that land. So they had no interest in saying, we're going to play nice with the Native Americans and give them their territory and we'll stay on our, no, absolutely did not work out that way. So you have escalating tensions over a 10-year period. Protests against taxation lead to British troops being sent to Boston, which leads to the Boston Massacre in 1770, which leads to British troops being removed from Boston, which leads to a period of relative peace for a little while, and then more revenue policies. This thing called the Boston Tea Party comes up. The British government says, we've had enough of all of these darn violent protests. We're sending more troops to Boston, and we're shutting down the colonial government of Massachusetts, and we're sending troops in the summer of 1774, which brings us all the way back around to that man, John Young, who was standing there just doing sentry duty one night when somebody takes a shot at him. This garrison of British troops in Boston, again, British troops in America before the war started, it was a garrison from June 1774 to 1776. There were some British troops there before that, but not very many. These were British regular soldiers, part of the established professional army. They were not militia raised temporarily, or they were not loyalists raised just locally. They were part of the professional army, which makes my job easy because it's very easy to decide who the soldiers were and who they weren't. It gradually increased in size during this whole time period. So if you say how big was the garrison in Boston, I have to say exactly when, because it changed. So it went like this. We went from 2 regiments in 1772, 1773, 2.5 regiments, plus some artillery, about 1,200 men. In the summer in 1774, we had 6 more regiments. This is the coercive acts. We're really going to clamp down. 2,500 more soldiers. Later that year, 3.5 more regiments. Now, some were coming from places like New York and Quebec down to Boston. Early June 1775, now things are getting even more tense. The British government says we're sending more troops. 4 more regiments embark in Great Britain before there's any news that a war has broke out. But when they get here, they find out, ooh, that Lexington and Concord thing, not good. Late June 1775, after the Battle of Bunker Hill, 4 more regiments arrived. Now, again, they left left Great Britain before it was clear that there was a war going on in America. And think a minute about being a British soldier, getting on a ship, saying you're going to America to keep peace, to keep the tensions down. And then you arrive in Boston and get off the ship 2 or 3 days after the Battle of Bunker Hill. And they say, hey, guess what? A quarter of the army has just been killed, and now you have to come out and fill some of the gaps. Ooh, not a good feeling, right? Late 1775, 2 more regiments join. So by The end of 1775, after the war is underway, we have about 10,000 men in this garrison, more British soldiers than the adult male population of Boston at that time. I'm using this word regiment. Think of that as about 450 officers and men. If you're thinking just about soldiers taking the field, thinking about 400 men is a good general rule of thumb early in the war. After the middle of 1776, start thinking of a regiment as about 500 men. This is a generality, but if you're reading a book that says there were 5 regiments there and 6 over there, and they went there, this just gives you a sense of the order of magnitude if you think of a regiment as being around 500 men. And it applies pretty well to the American troops and the German troops as well, again, as a round figure to use. So I just said 10,000 soldiers. Here's one of them, a man named James Renison, born in 1743 in Kendal, County Westmoreland in the northwest of England, 5'6" tall, hazel eyes, brown hair, swarthy complexion, and a round visage. He was a weaver before he joined the British Army. He joined the 59th Regiment of Foot in around 1759, and by 1775, he was a sergeant. And on the very first day of the war, he was wounded in the thigh on April 19th. But that wound did not stop him from also fighting in the Battle of Bunker Hill only 2 months later. Okay, well, professional soldier. This is what these guys do, right? And then, after he's been in America since about 1767, but he's been in 2 big battles, and then in 1775, at the end of the year, his regiment gets sent home. Woohoo! My war is over, right? Not quite. His regiment gets sent to Gibraltar. Now, what happened in Gibraltar during the American Revolution? One of the biggest sieges in all of British military history. The French and the Spanish tried to unseat Gibraltar from their garrison, laid siege to Gibraltar for 4 years. A 4-year-long siege, which ultimately failed, and British have Gibraltar to this day. But this guy, who had been wounded at Lexington and Concord, was there for 4 years. He was discharged from the Army in 1778 at the age of 45 after 29 years of service, and he got a pension from the British government. So what do you suppose a guy like this does now? He does what many, many thousands of British soldiers with careers like this did. He joined the Army again. He served in the 6th Regiment of Foot for 6 more years, was discharged again, went back on the pension rolls. Now what do you suppose he does? He's a professional soldier. He joins the Army again. He serves in the 95th Regiment of Foot for 6 more years. Somewhere in that long military career, he lost his middle finger on one hand. Sadly, we don't know where that finger is or where he lost it, at least. Discharged again, back on the pension rolls. Now what's he gonna do? Are you catching on yet? Career soldier. He goes back into the Army, this time into what's called an invalid corps. He's no longer fit to go on campaigns overseas, but he can still do good things for the Army on the home front. He serves in the garrison of Chester until 1802, when he's discharged at the age of 59 after 40 years in the Army. And then the following year, he gets called up to serve again in 1803. But the Army decides, okay, you're no longer fit for service. You can get a break now. The challenge I have when I study British soldiers and I want to give a talk like this and find somebody with a cool career like this is not finding somebody with its sort of career. It's figuring out who among thousands I'm going to talk about, because I can only introduce you to one soldier. And this kind of career was very, very common for the British soldiers who served in America during the Revolutionary War. Why don't more of them leave their diaries and journals? This guy spent 40 years in the Army, and only one little piece of it, not quite a whole year, was involved in the American Revolution. It wasn't a highlight of his career by any stretch. Now, I've talked about this as being the British Army. You will find books that call it the English Army. And that annoys me because not all English people are British, or not all British people are English. All English people are British. Um, just like the Germans were not all Hessians, and George Washington was from Virginia, right? But not all Americans were Virginian. Calling this army the English army would be like calling the Continental Army the Army of Virginia. It's not the same thing. So in our regiments of about 400 men, now I'm talking only about the sergeants, corporals, drummers, fifers, and private soldiers, not about the officers. For the rest of this talk, nothing I say pertains to the officers, okay? I study the private soldiers because they need me. Other people study the officers, but nobody else studies the rank and file soldier. So I do. In the 22nd Regiment of Foot, as an example, this is a regiment that arrived just after the Battle of Bunker Hill. I know the nationalities of 216 of these soldiers. 84 were English, 70 Scottish, 56 Irish, 2 Welsh, and 4 foreign. Foreign includes a smattering of Germans and a smattering of Americans. The 23rd Regiment of Foot, the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, I know the nationality of 154 of these men. This regiment arrived in New York in 1773 and then was sent to Boston. 121 English, 15 Scottish, 10 Irish, 2 Welsh, and 5 foreign. Clearly, by this time, the term Welsh was strictly an honorific. They were not from Wales any more than all of us are from Washington, D.C., just because we happen to be here now. And in the 38th Regiment of Foot, they arrived in the summer of 1774, 140 nationalities, 82 English, 16 Scottish, 40 Irish, 2 Welsh. You get the trend. If I broke down these by counties, you'd see people from all over England and all over Scotland and all over Ireland and all over Wales. These regiments didn't recruit locally as they started to do later on in the British Army history. You get almost any British regiment, with a few exceptions in America, has this kind of a national mix within it. Here's an example. Alexander MacLean was born in 1742 in St. Mary's, Kilkenny, County Leinster in Ireland. Anybody been there? He was a fifer in the 38th Regiment of Foot's Grenadier Company, and he was wounded in the left arm at the Battle of Bunker Hill on June 17, 1775. But that did not stop his ability to be a soldier. He rose in the ranks to become a sergeant. He continued in the Army until 1796 at the age of 54. Now, again, he's in the regular ranks of the regular Army. He got a pension for his 31 years of service, but then he went back and joined an Irish militia regiment and continued to serve until 1804 at the age of 62. Again, nothing unusual at all about this. 1801 Irish militia. Here's a man. Oh, yeah, I was wounded at the Battle of Bunker Hill. And at that time, he was already 33 years old, serving in the Army. So we talked a little bit about ages. If you enlisted in the British Army at peacetime, before the American War began, you didn't enlist for a 4-year stint or a 2-year hitch or some other defined. You just enlisted. Very much like, it's not quite the same today, but 20, 30 years ago anyway, when you'd get a job, you didn't say, I would like to have this job and I would like to work for you for 3 years. Like, no, you just get a job and you work. Well, you work in the British Army until you're discharged from the Army. And usually you're discharged when you're no longer fit for service. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means fit for service means you can do something like walk from downtown Boston to Concord, Massachusetts and back on the same day. That's about a 40-mile round trip. It means you can spend your summers sleeping in tents and moving from place to place in a very itinerant situation. If you stay in decent health, you can do that well into your 40s, early 50s. That's not so unusual. After the war began, and even later, when the British government made a commitment to say, this is going to be a big war, and we got to really gear up our military, they did change the recruiting laws to say that you can enlist for a fixed term of service, only if you enlisted after this date. None of the British soldiers in Boston enlisted under these terms, so I'm going to leave that aside for now. So all the soldiers who you see serving in Boston are career soldiers. 1,200 of them in these three regiments I've talked about, the 22nd, 23rd, and 38th. I know the ages so far of 507. Now, it takes a while to find this information. If any of you would like to fund my research going forward, I can make these numbers even bigger. But it takes a while to find all this. So of these 507 men, have anybody here played the British soldier age game before? Anybody? If you've played this game before, please don't just jump in because you might already know the answers. That's no fun, right? Give other people a chance. 507 men out of about 1,200 in these three regiments. How many do you suppose are between the ages of 15 and 20? You may give your answer as a percentage or as a number. Anybody? 15 to 20 years old? Proportion in the Army? Think about what you know about armies. Nobody's even willing to hazard a guess. Oh, well. Well, okay, I'll tell you the answer. 18 of them altogether, which is about 4%. How many do you suppose between the ages of 21 and 25? Anybody? Anybody? 6 altogether, 6%. Anybody else? 25%. It's 73 individuals, or 14% of them. So now we're up to 25 years old, and we have less than 20% of the soldiers altogether in this army. How many do you suppose are between 26 and 30 years old? 158. Now we're getting a pretty big number. Almost a third of them are between 26 and 30 years old. And now about a fifth of them are between 31 and 35 years old. And almost the same amount between 36 and 40, 41 to 45. Numbers are going down. Between 51 and 55 years old, 1%. This is a pretty typical curve. If you want a normal distribution, a bell curve, we're getting in that direction here. Pretty typical age distribution for British regiments serving in America during the Revolutionary War. If anything, it skews a little bit young compared to other regiments I've studied, just a little bit. If you randomly pulled a British soldier out of the ranks of a British regiment, odds are pretty good that you'd find somebody between the ages of 25 and 40. Why such older guys when we often think of armies as being demographically younger? Well, career soldiers who serve until they're no longer fit for service. About 60% of the soldiers who served in America are going to, at any given time, are going to be between 25 and 40, with about 20% younger and 20% older than that. Now let's talk about those conscripts. We've heard about men being pressed in press gangs and compulsory service and things like that. So what proportion of these soldiers in Boston in 1775 do you think are conscripts? If you've played this game before, please keep your answer to yourself. Anybody? Proportion of conscripts. Somebody give me a number. Somebody give me an uninformed number. Percentage of conscripts. Yeah, 0 is the right answer. It is a trick question. It was not legal to press men into service in England, in Great Britain, during this time period. The British Army was an all-volunteer force of career soldiers. Now, as you get to the Revolution entire, there is an exception to this that comes up. What happened in 1778 that changed the nature of the war for Great Britain? Anybody? 1778, big change? France joins the war. France joins the war, exactly. So suddenly, instead of having an enemy that's 3,000 miles away, now you have an enemy that you can see on a clear day. Oh boy. So Great Britain needs to go seriously on a war footing now. And in order to bolster the army significantly, they put into effect a press act, which allows men to be pressed into service. There are a lot of restrictions on this. Again, at the end of this talk, I'll recommend a book that talks about this in great detail. You can press men into the Army, and it is a disaster. It goes really badly for the local population who hates this idea. And the other group that hates this idea is the Army. Because when you have an all volunteer force of career soldiers, and all of a sudden you put men in the mix and you say, guess what? You get to serve beside this guy who doesn't want to be here. That tends to go down badly. So the Army repealed the Press Act in 1780 when the war was still going on. That's how poorly it worked. Unfortunately, a lot of modern authors just look at generalized information about recruiting during this whole time period and bundle it all together and assume that what was true in 1770, in say 1778, was also true in 1771 and also true in 1785, and that's not the case. So we have to look at it with more nuance than that. No conscripts in the British Army in Boston is where we're going with this. Here's another guy, not a conscript, John Smith, born St. Andrews, Norfolk, 1731. He was a dyer before joining the Army, part of the massive British textile industry. He joined the 4th Regiment of Foot in 1754, and he was wounded in the leg in the French and Indian War at the taking of an island called Martinique in 1762. But that didn't stop him soldiering. He was in the Grenadier Company of the 4th Regiment of Foot on April 19, 1775. He was 44 years old at that time, and he was wounded again through his thigh. And that didn't stop him from soldiering on. He wasn't discharged until 1788 at the age of 51. No, at the age of 57, rather, read my slide, with 31 years of service in the Army. Again, so long career, 2 wounds, American Revolution, just a little piece of it. Now let's move back to Boston. We're moving along here. It's March of 1775. There is no war going on, but there's a lot of tension. Americans are trying to do things like smuggle gunpowder and weapons out of Boston. The countryside is becoming militarized. Militias are practicing everywhere. Americans are trying to stockpile weapons and ammunition and warlike stores, tents, and preserved food and things. British soldiers are searching people leaving Boston. Remember that little thin neck of land there and the fortifications and the gates and everything? Searching people leaving with wagons, searching the carts, looking for contraband, and a crowd gathers. As one British officer wrote, the country people were very abusive. One man said he would whip the arse of any regular there and challenge them to turn out and fight. So there's trouble brewing. The soldiers were irritated a little, as you might guess, because this wasn't the first time this kind of thing had happened. And then a man with a bag of kettles, lifting up the skirt of his coat, struck his hand as an insult to the soldiers on his backside. Ah! Again, this irritated the soldiers. So one of the soldiers kicked the guy. So the guy turned around and he struck the soldier on the face with his bag of kettles. Ah! And a scuffle ensued, as you might guess. And welcome to being a British soldier in Boston in 1774 and 1775. This was a terrible time for these guys. They were trying to keep the peace and getting hit in the face with a bag of kettles. I don't even want to think about what that felt like. They were also the soldiers preparing and training for war. Another thing that a lot of books overlook is the extent to which these soldiers were practicing. They knew that to preserve peace, they were probably going to have to do things like march out into the countryside and seize gunpowder and seize weapons. And they needed to be ready to do this. They didn't want a fight, but if one was going to come, they better be prepared. So they were learning to work together as brigades. Again, a brigade is a group of 2 or 3 or 4 regiments. And these regiments, as I said, some had been in New York and some in Canada and some in Ireland. Now they were together and they were spending this 11-month period learning to work together. They were acclimating to living in encampments. Some had been quartered in different cities and whatnot. Now they got to get used to doing all this, putting the tents up, taking them down quickly, efficiently. They were building fortifications, lots of manual labor. They were fitting out barracks because they knew that winter was coming. They were doing fitness training. Every week or two, a British regiment would go on a 5, 8, 10-mile march out into the countryside and back with full knapsacks on, the things soldiers do to become fit for campaigning. They were practicing firing at marks, target practice. And did you say target practice? A lot of books talk about, oh, British soldiers didn't aim, they just pointed their guns and shot. Well, not being a bunch of complete idiots and having been using firearms for over a century now, the British military had figured out that you're more likely to hit something if you aim at it. So they practiced firing at marks regularly, which is where we get the term marksmanship, right? If you read the British training manual that was universally used on both the British and American side during this time period, it describes pointing the weapon, and it says the left eye shut and look along the barrel with the right eye from the breech pin to the muzzle. Now, in the British Manual of Arms, this position was called present. The Americans adapted their own manual. They called it take aim instead of present. And some authors actually say that, oh, so the Americans introduced the concept of aiming. Well, again, this is how the present position is described. Just because it doesn't have a name that says aim doesn't mean it's not aiming. Furthermore, here's a picture of a British musket from a British training manual. And if you go through those doors and have a chance to look at the exhibit, you can see a real one in there. It has a little thing on the end of the barrel. And if you talk to a reenactor or a lot of gun collectors, they'll often say this thing is called the bayonet lug because it happens that the bayonet locks onto it. But if you look at the picture of the weapon from British training manuals from the time period, it's got a little designation for the thing on the end of the barrel, and down in the legend here, that little thing is called a sight. Now, the sight implies a function, doesn't it, other than holding the bayonet. So you'll hear people call it a bayonet lug, but you wouldn't hear a British soldier in the 18th century calling it that. British soldiers in Boston between the end of 1774 and April 19th, 1775, in training, fired about 80 rounds per man from their muzzle-loading flintlock muskets, firing at marks, doing target practice. Anybody here fired black powder weapons before? Yeah, you probably know 80 rounds doesn't sound like a lot for modern repeating firearms, but for a muzzle-loading long gun like this, 80 rounds is kind of a lot. That would take you a long time to fire 80 rounds. But they're going out every few days and firing maybe 10 rounds at a time, practicing at target practice. Let's go to another person in the British Army during this time period in the Boston garrison. Her name is Sarah Brown. She was married to William Brown, a soldier in the 23rd Regiment of Foot, who was in the regiment before 1763. I do not know when they got married, but what I do know is that he was wounded on April 19th, and he died the next day. And his wife is here with him in Boston. What does she do? Well, sadly, I don't know very much about what she does. I can make some guesses, but what I do know is that she stayed with the Army. She remained in some capacity or another, maybe working as a nurse, maybe working as a sutler, a purveyor of provisions, maybe working as a washerwoman. But one way or another, she was still with the British Army in New York when she remarried in 1770. Now, she married someone who was not in the Army, but the marriage license clearly says Sarah Brown, widow, 23rd Regiment of Foot, married to, I don't remember the mariner's name because he's a sailor, that she was able to remain with the Army even though she had lost her husband. So what are all these wives doing with an army in Boston? Remember, it's not an army sent to go to war. It's an army sent to maintain peace. And it's an army of all volunteer career soldiers. If you want men to enlist in an army as voluntarily and remain in it as a career, and you're going to send these men on overseas deployments for 7 years at a time or so during peacetime, it's a pretty good idea to allow dependents to go with them, right? Can you think of a more modern army that does things like this? That, for example, sends troops to Germany or South Korea or Japan and allows dependents to accompany these soldiers when they go on these long deployments. Does that sound like any army you've heard of today? Like the US Army, maybe? So again, the same rationale applies. The living conditions and circumstances are different, but the very fundamental rationale for allowing dependents to go on overseas deployments has not changed. Soldiers' wives accompanied the British Army on overseas deployments in peacetime and in wartime. About 1 in 6 men in the British garrison in Boston had wives with them. Some wives did stay behind in Great Britain. Some soldiers married after they arrived in America. Sadly, we don't have comprehensive marriage records. So even though we have an idea of how many wives there were, we don't know which ones married in America, which ones came with the Army from Great Britain. But what we do know is that just like the modern military today, a common soldier could not support a wife and a family just on his own base pay. So his wife had to also work. Again, shouldn't be any surprise if you've known any soldiers. So the wives could do work for the Army, or they could find their own work, sometimes supporting the Army in various ways. Nurses in Army hospitals was a very common job for Army wives. Washerwomen, people to do the laundry, was the most common of the job for Army wives. Some Army wives got licenses to purvey provisions to the Army in a job called sutlers. Others did work when it was demanded. We need people to bring in the hay for the Army. We need people to cut turf for fuel, other kinds of jobs. When the 22nd Regiment of Foot arrived in Boston right after the Battle of Bunker Hill, they had 422 soldiers, 60 wives, and an unknown but probably similar number of children in the regiment. That's a whole topic in itself. Sadly, I can only give you a couple of slides. There were probably about 1,500 wives with this British garrison of 10,000 men in Boston. In garrison, some barracks had a room for the married couples, not a room for each married couple, but a room for all of the married couples. Some couples found lodging nearby. It was very common for the wife to rent lodgings near where the regiment was encamped or quartered. Once war began, a separate barrack was designated just for the dependents. Again, sometimes rented lodgings. Now we're finally going to get to the outbreak of war, right? The war that you've all been waiting for. April 19th, 1775, British soldiers march out of Boston. About 700 set out early in the morning to seize or destroy military stores in Concord, Massachusetts. There was no war going on. And it's really important to remember that when we think about what happened. These soldiers weren't marching off to war. They were marching off for an entirely different purpose than fighting a war that day. But ooh, it was tense, and they knew it was tense. They started their 40-mile round trip by wading through 2 creeks up to their mid-thighs. This is another thing that almost everybody leaves out of their accounts of this. And I just think, if you got to march 40 miles, do you really want to start by getting soaked up to your thighs and then having to start marching 40 miles? Really? And then, oh, by the way, you're going to have to fight your way half of that? Most of the fighting occurred on the return march from Concord. So there was a little thing that you can barely call a skirmish at Lexington. And then go do your business at Concord. There's another skirmish. It's on the way back that the real fighting starts. And a lot of literature gets put into assessing the performance of the British Army this day, overlooking that one little detail that there was no war going on at dawn that day. So when they set out, they were not intending to fight a war. The individual companies had not trained together for combat. So they sent 21 companies. A company is 1/10 of a regiment, 21 companies that hadn't worked together for combat. And some authors write, well, that was dumb, but it's like, why train them for combat when there's no war going on? That wasn't what they were expecting to happen. They did achieve all of their objectives that day. They marched out to Concord. They found military stores. They destroyed them all. They marched back. I actually had somebody ask, why did the British lose the battle? It's like, well, what measurement are you using for won or lost? They weren't intending to occupy and fortify the town of Concord. Their goal was to go to Concord, destroy military stores, and go back. They just weren't expecting to have a lot of men killed when they did it. But they did succeed in their basic objective. So a lot of people says, well, they retreated to Boston. Well, they were going to do that anyway. Their orders were to go out and go back. So they went back. If you want to call it a retreat, you can do that. The troops had been awake for about 36 hours before the heavy fighting began. Besides that whole walking through the two streams thing, they had marched for over 20 miles. And I even see people criticize them for staying on the road where they're somewhat exposed. But if you want to get back to Boston the fastest way possible, take the road. That only makes sense. And the British flanking parties, the ones who went off the road to push Americans out from behind these stone walls and chase them away, they were really effective for a while. But those men doing that work got exhausted. Again, they had already been awake for 36 hours and already marched over 20 miles. Like, okay, now trot out there and chase them from that wall. Trot out there and do it again. And again, and again, and again. It gets tired out. Not being an apologist here, but if we're going to assess a military operation in any way at all, there's a lot of things you got to take into consideration. And people look all the time at the command and control and the this and the that, and they forget about some of the very basic human things about what the soldiers were dealing with. Oh yeah, and they were really badly outnumbered. Forgot about that part. It's also important to remember when looking at this fight on April 19th, 1775, that in the context of the American War, it was a total anomaly. No other event like this happened to the British Army during the entire war. So it's kind of a foolish one to assess and say, how did the British Army do? And they put all this emphasis on this one battle that wasn't like any other battle during the war. Here's another soldier, John Mosley, born 1744 in the city of Leicester in the county of Leicestershire, 5'6" 3/4 inches tall, enlisted in the 12th Regiment of Foot in 1764. By April 1775, he's in the Light Infantry Company of the 5th Regiment of Foot. As you may have guessed, he's one of these guys who marched out to Concord. He was wounded in the left arm on April 19th. He was wounded again in the left shoulder 2 months later at the Battle of Bunker Hill. He was wounded again in the right knee at the Battle of Brandywine in September 1777. And he continued to serve in the British Army as a private soldier until June of 1784. Again, this is the kind of soldiers you had in this army, professional career soldiers. 3 wounds doesn't knock him out of the fight. He received an army pension at the end of the war. This is his signature on his discharge document. Here's another one. I don't remember why he's in. Oh, John Norton. Yes, he's very important. John Norton was not a soldier. He was the son of a soldier. He was the son of a sergeant in the 43rd Regiment of Foot. Now, that sergeant happened to be the child of a man in the Cherokee Nation in America, but that's another story. Don't have time for him. John Norton wrote in a letter in the 1790s, I was born in the British Army, and the first recollection I had was at Boston. I was about 3 years of age when Bunker's Hill was fought, having had a view of it from the top of a house in Boston. Again, this battle's going on. His father is in that battle, and he gets to be up on a housetop watching it happen. Just imagine that for a minute. I retain a confused recollection of that remarkable event impressed upon my mind. Sadly, he didn't then write what that recollection was, which is a real shame. But imagine 3 years old witnessing that battle. But there were a lot of children with the British Army and the British garrison just like him. And he enlisted as a soldier in the British Army when he was 15 years old. Of course, the American Revolution had ended by then. Battle of Bunker Hill, we're almost done here, so hang in there for a few more slides. I talked about Boston being a peninsula. Bunker Hill was on a peninsula, the Charlestown Peninsula. If you think of Boston here projecting like a leaf out into Boston Harbor, Charlestown Peninsula is like another leaf projecting out with a little gap of water between the two. So there's these nice two little leaves facing each other. And you probably know the general story that the Americans fortified a hilltop and the British attacked it and got their clocks cleaned that day, right? I am calling it the Battle of Bunker Hill. A lot of things today will say, oh no, you go in any room full of historians and somebody's bound to say, well, actually, it was fought on Breed's Hill, not Bunker. Yeah. At the time the battle was fought, nobody called this other eminence Breed's Hill. There was a Breed's farm and a Breed's pasture, but there was no place that everybody called Breed's Hill. The battle, furthermore, didn't take place only on that one hill. The Americans built a fort on the hill, but they also built a series of fortifications that went off the hill and down these slopes between two hills. Here's Bunker Hill proper. Here's the hill that today we call Breed's Hill. If you looked at this from the side, it would be sort of saddle shaped with Bunker Hill significantly taller and then a low part, but still up, and then Breed's Hill, and then down the slopes and toward where Boston is. The Americans built a redoubt here because it's closer to Boston, but the battle raged on places that were not on this hill at all. The whole town of Charleston was set on fire because American snipers were in it. British troops tried to get around the end of these American lines here, nowhere near Breed's Hill, but this is where some of the hottest fighting of the day took place. So, and finally, perhaps most importantly, Bunker Hill was the British objective. So when they landed, they were trying to take Bunker Hill. They wanted to be closer to American positions here on the other end of the peninsula. And they ended up there, and it's perfectly normal for British soldiers to write their letters home from the place they ended up. We're at Bunker Hill. So we just fought a battle to capture Bunker Hill. So it's the Battle of Bunker Hill. Nothing wrong with that. All the actually people, no. Very common for battles to not be named for the exact spot where they took place, by the way. Look at lots of others. So anyway, I'm calling it Bunker Hill, and you can't stop me. You all know what happened that day. The British did take the hill, but at an enormous cost. About half of the soldiers committed to the battle were killed or wounded, close to 1,100 casualties. We have to remember that it was a very rushed operation. The Americans built the fortifications by total surprise during the night. The British said, oh, geez, in the morning at dawn, what are we going to do? Well, if you've been in the Army, you know it's hard to make an army move instantaneously. And you got to get them across the water and this and that. We have to do it fast, but there's a limit to how fast we can do it. The tides slowed the deployment of troops. We have to row them across the water. And that, again, there's a lot of considerations about doing it. The British had every intention to pull a flanking attack to go around one side of those fortifications I showed along a beach. They didn't know that the beach was also fortified. So it wasn't just a willy-nilly foolish frontal assault. At least that wasn't the plan. Those soldiers who did end up having to press frontally toward the fortifications, the normal British way to do this would be to charge at them. Professional soldiers run fast with bayonets. Unprofessional soldiers on the other side don't want to see those bayonets up close. They're likely to flee if you can get there quickly. The British couldn't get there quickly. What they found up the slopes of this hill was knee-high grass that was often obscuring stone walls and rail fences and hedges and brick kilns and saw pits and all kinds of obstructions. They could not do the kind of fast advance that they normally would have done here. Due to a total foul-up, they did not have any field artillery. If they had just had some artillery pieces, to play on that American rail fence. Those Americans wouldn't have stayed very long. So due to an operational failing, they had no artillery. There were a significant number of friendly fire casualties on the British side, which is widely overlooked, but well documented. Talk to me after class if you want to know more about that. And also, we can't forget that the British did drastically underestimate American resolve. So again, no apologia going here. The British fouled up this operation, but again, thinking about the moment to moment on the ground from the human level, you can see a lot of reasons why it can go wrong. It's always hard to look at these things in hindsight because we already know what happened. We weren't the ones waking up on the morning of June 17th saying, oh my gosh, they built a fort on that hill. What the heck are we going to do? We have to do this. We have to do it fast. It's not easy. Again, nothing like this happened again during the war. Bunker Hill gets overly assessed in talking about the British military performance during an 8-year war. And these two anomalous battles right at the beginning are often used as benchmarks. Look at other wars. You can find case after case where good armies do really badly in the first few months of a new war that they weren't expecting, right? So if you want to benchmark performance, these are terrible benchmarks, but people use them all the time. Couple more soldiers and we'll be one more soldier, then we'll be done. Lucky you. Last man I want to talk about, Dennis Green. He was in the Grenadier Company of the 5th Regiment of Foot, discharged in June 1783. And this is his discharge document. All this demographic material I've been giving you, ages, where they were born, come mostly from discharge documents like these. That is a real one. So now you know I'm not a pathological liar. There are documents behind this stuff. There are thousands upon thousands of these in the British National Archives. And I know this because I've read about 25,000 of them so far. And there's more to go through. And here and there we find gems like this one. The top part of it, it's a form, printed form, filled in, and it's got all this stuff. His name, he was a soldier, tells that he was born in the town of Mallow in County Cork, how old he was 5 feet 11 1/4 inches tall and all this. But on this one, it's what's on the bottom that's really cool. The surgeon left an affidavit, the military doctor who examined him, and he said, I certify that the above named Dennis Green has been for these 5 years laboring under a complaint occasioned by a musket shot which still remains in his body. He received at Lexington in North America and is so reduced in body that it does not seem probable he will recover and will not by labor be able to provide a maintenance for himself, which means he's a good object for a pension. But look at this. He was wounded on the first day of the war, right? A musket ball in his body that stayed there. And he remained a soldier in this war in America for 5 more years before being discharged and sent home. And he took that relic of the war with him for the rest of his life. He had the American war inside of him for the rest of his life. And this is the kind of soldiers who were in the British Army in the Boston garrison, the kind of men who fought the American Revolution. If you want to know more about them, I have a book about it that Andrew was kind enough to mention. Thank you. You can order signed copies from my local independent bookstore, which is always the best way to buy a book if you can possibly do it. You know, we have a free market. Buy the book any way you want to. But if you can buy books at a local independent bookstore, that's the best thing for the bookstore. It's the best thing for the publisher, and it's the best thing for the author. Because if you go to a volume discounter, the discount gets passed on to the author. That's another story. If you like these anecdotes about British soldiers, I have a blog. The URL is here. If you want to contact me and say, I don't know what I'm talking about, and you want to argue any of these points or want more information, my email address, and I'm the editor of the Journal of the American Revolution, which you can subscribe to absolutely free on the internet at allthingsliberty.com. And I will be happy to take any questions that you might have. Thank you.
Thank you, Don. We will have a brief question and answer session. So if you have a question for Don, please raise your hand and I will bring the microphone over to you so our audience on Zoom can hear us. Thank you.
Yes, my question is the pay that British soldiers got. How did that compare with the kind of wages they would get in a civilian?
That's a great question, and I actually go into that in detail in this very book, but I'll give you a summary. Most texts that you read will say the British soldiers' pay was terrible. They got 8 pence a day, and from that, there were deductions for his food and his clothing. So he didn't make any money. Well, I look at this and say, okay, that's sort of true, but it's out of context. Number one, if you get paid at your job, then you have to pay for your clothing and your food. So all the British Army was doing when they were deducting for clothing and food were helping these soldiers manage a budget because it's normal to have to pay for food and clothing out of your pay. British soldiers did not have to pay for lodging, which a civilian did have to pay for. So they do get a saving out of this. Their budgets are sort of being managed in a way. But besides that, all that 8 pence a day, which is about maybe 2/3 of what a common laborer will earn, that's the base pay. And there were all sorts of ways that soldiers could earn additional money. Remember, I talked about building fortifications around Boston? You work on these work details 1 day out of 3, and you get paid extra for that. If you know how to row a boat well and you say, okay, you're going to have to do the ferry duty from Boston to Charlestown Neck now that it's occupied, you get paid extra for that. All those men in the textile industry, if you're a shoemaker or a tailor, you work on the regiment's uniforms and clothing, you get paid extra for that. Lots and lots of opportunities to earn money over and above the base pay. So I'm glad you asked the question because it's a case where the literature often dumbs it down and makes things look a lot worse than they actually were. Now, soldiers aren't getting rich either, but that's not what soldiers do, right? You know, it's not super well paying, but if you're a diligent soldier and you work on the work parties and all this, you can earn a sufficient living. And I have examples in the book of soldiers being discharged from the Army and getting significant amounts of back pay due to them. Thank you for asking that one.
Yeah, I read once about the Wellington's campaign in the peninsula, and there was a description at the very beginning of this book about the tremendous complexity of the organization, especially for an expeditionary force, in terms of supply and conflicting authority and cross commands and difficulties in transport. I was wondering if you could just outline briefly what kind of uh, command structure that these guys would have had and what kind of complications that would have ensued for the men in the field.
Okay, this is tricky. One of the first things I think is ever actually try to command an expeditionary force. I mean, I haven't either, but I did spend many years at the Naval War College working with people who did, and it's complicated to this day. The complications that the British Army face here, they had an army that was designed to send regiments of soldiers overseas for extended periods on deployment. So it was an army of empire. So in a lot of ways, they had some of this stuff figured out, but they were accustomed to sending troops to places in the British Empire where they would have good solid bases of operations and be able to do things like get all the firewood they needed and all the forage and food they needed from the local loyal populations. And an immediate problem that the British Army had once the war began was they didn't have access to the countryside, cooped up on a peninsula. And then as the war progressed, they end up cooped up in New York and cooped up in Rhode Island and cooped up in Philadelphia and cooped up in Charlestown. And they can't go out into the countryside and get all of the stuff that they need. And that means it all has to come from Great Britain. And that's really, really expensive. It requires a tremendous logistic effort. It's the most far flung military expedition at this scale that Great Britain has ever undertaken. In the French and Indian War, they didn't send nearly as many troops to America as they did during the Revolutionary War. So long learning curve there. Logistics is, I would say, the biggest one. At the beginning of the war, there were some command structure issues because you're taking a peacetime army and converting it into a wartime army. And you always get a lot of command glitch. I don't care whose army you're in or what war. That's always going to be challenging. But if you start to get to 17 campaigns of 76 and 77, you'll see that tactically and on the campaigning level, a lot of that stuff is worked out. You're always going to find problems, but the British Army starts operating really efficiently and effectively in these campaigns. Strategy is the problem now. How do you send an army overseas to an unfamiliar country to pacify a foreign population that you don't understand very well? Do you suppose that armies today have this all figured out? No, they do not. This has been a consistent problem for armies ever since there were armies. This was not a case where the Spanish invaded North America and the British came to try to push them back. This was a local insert. This was an uprising of British citizens against the British government. How do you use a military to fix that? Especially when you're a long way away and you don't really understand the nature of that population that's having their uprising. Still a challenge for armies, and that's the other big thing. You know, it's kind of high level, but all the other kinds of operational challenges you see that the Army faces, I'm gonna step out on a limb and see that they're kind of typical for armies, and they come and they go during the war. They have their command structure issues sometimes and this and that. But the biggest problems are the logistics thing and the strategy thing.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It seems as the volunteers or the people who fought were all pretty homogeneously English. I was wondering if you came across any Scots, Welsh, Irish.
I hate to say, did you see all the slides? But I showed a slide before that gave the demographic breakdowns of 3 regiments. They were not nearly homogeneously English. Any given British regiment was, again, ballpark figures because everyone had variations, but every British regiment was approximately half English, a quarter Scottish, and a quarter Irish, and then a smattering of foreigners, which includes continental Europeans, which includes North Americans, which includes even a few Caribbean and others. But it's the British Army, not the English Army by any stretch.
And
The proportions vary regiment to regiment, but that's the ballpark.
in the officer corps?
Everything that I study deals with the rank and file soldiers. I couldn't give you stats on the officer corps, but I bet it's going to be pretty similar, about half English, quarter Scottish, quarter Irish, again, with variation, but regiment to regiment. You know, there was a slide on that very subject. It happens, I know. It's a long class.
Hi, I understand that the British recruited slaves, Black people, and I'm wondering, since you talk about them having being career soldiers, I'm wondering were some of the Black soldiers, do they become career soldiers as well?
That's a great question. So the British Army typically recruits from places where it is actually going to fight the war. So when the Army goes to, say, India, they recruit regiments of soldiers from India. When they come to America, they recruit regiments of Americans. As the war progresses, they raise regiments, they call them regiments of loyalists in America. For the most part, they segregate this organization. So they recruit large numbers of Blacks who are escaping from slavery. I'm using that term generally because there's also a lot of Native American slaves in here, but generally people of color come to the British Army because in England, slavery is not even legal anymore. It's legal in the colonies, but not in England. And the British government in general, you know, with a lot of specifics going on, starts issuing proclamations saying, if you're enslaved, run away, come to us, join the army, and we'll take care of you. For some of them, it works out really well at the end of the war, and for some it doesn't. That's kind of another story, and I can point you to some nice articles on that. But within the army, most of the blacks serving in the British Army serve in corps of what they call pioneers, which really are laborers. So they're building a lot of fortifications, cutting down a lot of trees. But if you get more nuanced and look at individual regiments, you start finding individuals. The 29th Regiment of Foot had at least one man born in Madras, India. They had 10 drummers, mostly born in the Caribbean, but some in Africa. And they were recognized for having black drummers. In fact, when they were serving in Boston in 1770, when a soldier was punished and got lashed as a punishment, it was the drummers in the regiment who gave the lashings. So suddenly the very puritanical Bostonians are seeing white soldiers being lashed by black drummers. And that's kind of startling to them. That gets at their sensibilities. Not used to that. As the war progresses, we find here and there hints of individuals, but the challenge that I have as a researcher is most of the documents we use don't tell us the ethnicity of people. So here and there, I find like, all right, here's a drummer with a name like John Jubo. Okay, there's a hint. It's not a very British name. And I see that the other drummers in the regiment who got, some of them did leave the army and get military pensions for long service. And we say, oh, he was born in Africa. He was born in the West Indies. And so adding these things up, we start finding, but also I find a man like Thomas Walker. Well, he was a black drummer in the 29th Regiment of Foot, captured at the Battle of Saratoga. He ended up dying as a prisoner of war in Pennsylvania. I wouldn't know his ethnicity, except that a Bostonian wrote that they called him a black rascal. And I know other things about the drummers in that particular regiment. So it's hard to find these individuals, but the more research I do, the more and more they keep turning up here and there. At the end of the war, the British government tried to take as many, I'm going to say freed slave men, the men and women who had abandoned slavery and joined the British Army, which it's not quite the same as calling them freed, right? Those who had fled slavery, gotten into the British Army, British started sending them to Nova Scotia. And the Americans started to object to this. The terms of the Treaty of Paris say that you will return all property that you took from Americans to Americans. And we look at these people as property. And the British were trying not to look at them as property and send, but for, I can't remember the number, several thousand got sent off to Nova Scotia, and then some of them went back and ended up forming Liberia. But then the British government was forced to stop doing this in 1783, and unfortunately, a lot of people did get returned to slavery. There's a huge amount of material that's gradually coalescing about this, and it's a great topic. Thank you for asking.
I have a two-part question about career soldiers.
I'll give you a 20-part answer.
You mentioned, I forget his name, Addison, something. It was a career soldier, like one of the first guys that you put up there. I was paying attention to the slides.
Renison.
Yeah, thank you. And you know, he had re-enlisted several times over the years, and you had that got me thinking when you said that the term of enlistment was your your ability to function or whatever,
fit for service.
fit for service. So if he was discharged, you know, presumptively he was not fit for service, but then multiple times he re-enlists, so that would infer that he actually is fit for service. So I was wondering about that. And then
well, I'll answer that one first. It's at the discretion of the recruiting officer. And I said in general, you get discharged when you're no longer fit for service, but due to operational needs, the size of regiments goes up and down. And sometimes when it goes down, they say, okay, we're going to take the 75 oldest soldiers and discharge them because they're more unfit for service than the other ones are. And then the need goes up. He goes back to another recruiting officer, another resident. He says, yeah, you're good enough. We'll take you. You're experienced. You seem pretty solid. So there's a lot of discretion going on there. You could certainly try to re-enlist after being discharged.
And then the second one was being as they are career soldiers. I'm wondering, especially the ones that that you outlined are actually from England. Did they have really strongly held political motivations? You're talking about how they leave thinking the situation is one way, they get there and the situation on the ground is totally different. They're being abused by colonists, things like this. I'm thinking, what motivates them beyond a paycheck? Did they have specific political, positions? They're, not happy with the colonists, really motivated to
Okay.
fight them. Where do they come down on that?
All right. Well, again, I can recommend a book on the subject, but motivation for enlistment is very seldom political. I've been doing this kind of research for a very long time, and so far I've found I don't like to guess why anyone joined the Army. So I look only at what individuals actually wrote down. So far, I've found a total of, I think the number is up to 38 individuals who wrote down why they joined the Army. And what I find is the reasons are not reasons you could deduce. For example, this man's mother died and his father remarried and he didn't get along with his stepmother, so he ran away and he joined the Army. That man said, I don't know, I just had a rambling disposition. I just always thought it would be cool to be a soldier. Somebody else said, I want to travel. My job is a weaver. I'm never going to get to go anywhere. So I joined the very personal kinds of reasons. Another man said he wanted to get away from the clamors of a wife, so I don't see any political, sadly, hardly any of these guys wrote anything down. So I can't really say much about politics. The ones who did write things down also don't write about politics. They write things like, I was just discontent. I didn't like the Army discipline. I got in trouble and I was afraid I was going to get lashed. And so I ran away. Things like that. We find changing sentiments, but they're usually for much more pragmatic, immediate reasons rather than ideological reasons.
How many, thank you for a great presentation. How many noble British volunteers, and for that matter, noble American volunteers, actually died at the Battle of Bunker Hill? I think it's worth noting that one especially noble American volunteer was Dr. Joseph Warren, who died rushing into the battlefield.
Well, that's right. It's correct that a lot of people died on both sides. The British took, I don't have exact numbers offhand, but about 1,000 casualties, of whom about between 200 and 300 died. The rest were wounded. I don't recall off the top of my head the number of American casualties. It was fewer than that. Is that the entirety of the question? How many died on each side during the Battle of Bunker Hill? Because I mean, I don't know the exact figures, but it was between 200 and 300 dead on the British side and somewhere between 100 and 200 dead on the American side. And yes, one of them on the American side was Joseph Warren. One of the ones on the British side was Lieutenant Colonel James Abercrombie.
Well, I will say that that's a great spot to wrap up because I'm going to plug our next lecture, which is on the Battle of Bunker Hill on the 250th anniversary of the battle on June 17th. So, Don, I want to thank you so much for being here and speaking to us on a fascinating subject. I want to thank all of you for coming out in person and for those of you joining us virtually on Zoom, and for all of you for your continued support of our mission. So thank you very much, everybody, and get home safe. We'll see you next time.